a whisper no one else heard, yet it pulled Holmes behind the curtain. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorne. Share in the mystery, comment where you're listening from. Your voices bring these stories alive. Let's begin. It was in the small hours of a damp October morning when I, Dr. John Watson, was roused by a most urgent knock upon our Baker Street door. The lamps along the thoroughfare flickered in the fog, casting long, trembling shadows, and the hush that clung to the air was thickened by drizzle. I had only just reached the stairhead when Mrs. Hudson, in her dressing gown, ushered a pale young woman into the sitting room. She looked no older than 25, yet her gloved hands trembled, and her eyes held the frantic sheen of one who had seen something they should not have. Holmes was already seated in his armchair, as ever, fully awake and shrouded in the smoke of his pipe, his long fingers steepled under his chin. "Ah," he said without a trace of surprise. "The theatre wakes before the city sleeps. Come in, miss." "Lenora Carville," she said with an effort. I beg your pardon for coming at such an hour, but I didn't know where else to go. Mr. Holmes, something terrible has happened at the Pavilion Theatre. I fear a murder may have taken place, or at least I heard something. I was alone, but I heard it." Holmes rose, offering her a chair with a small bow. "Miss Carville, compose yourself. Let us proceed with the facts. You are, I presume, an actress." She nodded. "I'm an understudy in The Flight of Camilla. It's a rather grand melodrama, though the critics have been less than kind. Still, the audiences come. I was staying late, rehearsing, alone. Miss Winter, the leading lady, had retired early with a headache." "And what precisely did you hear?" Lenora twisted her gloves tightly. "I was in the wings rehearsing my lines softly, trying not to disturb the watchman. The stage was empty, everyone had gone. Then behind the curtain I heard a whisper, a man's voice. Just one sentence. 'You shouldn't have come back, Miriam.'" "Miriam?" Holmes repeated, his eyes narrowing. "That is not the name of anyone in the company," she said quickly. "Not that I know of, but then after a long pause, I heard something fall, something heavy, like a body. And then silence." Watson, though often slow to leap to conclusions as Holmes did, felt a familiar cold trace its fingers down his back. The girl's sincerity was beyond doubt. Her words did not have the artifice of performance. "I went to look," she continued, "but there was no one behind the curtain. Only one of the thick theatre ropes had come loose and fallen, coiled like a snake at the edge of the stage. I was too frightened to stay. The watchman was asleep. I could hear him snoring in his little room. I slipped out the side door and came straight here." Holmes had moved to the window and now stood gazing out into the misty street, his silhouette a dark monolith against the pale curtains. "Fascinating," he murmured. "A theatre, a whisper, a name not in the playbill, and the sound of a falling weight. Watson, we must get dressed." "But, Holmes," I said, "surely if there were no sign of a body—" "Then there is all the more need to investigate. A whisper implies a witness, and a rope implies, well, something more sinister than clumsy scenery." He turned sharply to Miss Carville. "Did you recognize the voice?" She hesitated. At least, I don't think so. It wasn't loud, it was deliberate, but cold, almost like a stage whisper. Only, yes?" She dropped her voice. "Only it sounded like it knew the person, not like a line from a script, more like a threat." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "Miss Carville, you have done well to come to me. I must ask you not to return to the theatre until I give you word. Tell no one of this visit. If any inquiry is made, say only that you were taken ill. That will buy us time." She looked at him with wide eyes. Do you think someone was murdered? Holmes smiled faintly. I think someone meant someone else to think so. Whether that someone is real or part of a deeper performance remains to be seen. Within half an hour, we were on our way through the dawn-damp streets to the Pavilion Theatre, a grand but slightly decaying venue tucked into the southern end of Drury Lane. The fog pressed against its stained windows like hands of the forgotten poor, and the gas lamps flickered above the twin doors, closed now like the sealed mouth of a tomb. I've never liked theatres, Holmes muttered. Too many lies in the woodwork. We were admitted by a yawning watchman who looked startled to find anyone interested in the stage so early, but Holmes flashed a card, and a sovereign followed, loosening the man's tongue and his keys. Soon we were walking the darkened corridors of the theatre, past fading posters and discarded scripts. The stage, when we reached it, was still dressed in its props from the previous night's performance. Holmes paced the boards like a restless ghost, his eyes searching every detail. He bent to examine the fallen rope, sniffed it, then gestured for me to hold the end taut while he tested the pulley above. No fraying. This was cut, he said with quiet finality. I glanced at him. Cut deliberately? He nodded, with a blade that left a smooth edge, likely a stage knife. Then you do believe a crime occurred? I believe an illusion has been staged, he replied. The question is, was it meant for Miss Carville, or did she merely glimpse a second performance meant for someone else entirely? At that moment, he paused. His hand reached into the folds of the curtain and emerged with a single item. A black lace glove, small, feminine. The fingers curled slightly inward, as if grasping at a final word. Holmes turned it over. There, on the inner lining, stitched in faded gold thread, was a name, Miriam Wells. Holmes's eyes glinted. Watson, he said softly, we are not at the beginning of a mystery. We have arrived just after Act 2. And with that, the curtain on our own performance had lifted. Holmes held the black lace glove delicately between his fingers, the way one might hold a dried leaf from a long-forgotten letter. The name stitched within, Miriam Wells, gleamed faintly under the stage's single-lit gas sconce, its flame flickering as if troubled by the air around us. He handed the glove to me without a word, and I took it, turning it over thoughtfully. It bore no signs of blood or damage, only the impression that it had been left, not lost, as though it were a calling card placed with deliberation. Have you ever heard the name, Watson? Holmes asked, his tone quiet but sharp with purpose. I shook my head. It's unfamiliar to me, but you think Miss Carville's whisper, "You shouldn't have come back, Miriam," is connected to this? It is too coincidental not to be, Holmes replied. And yet it is too theatrical to be immediately believed. A whispered threat, a name unlisted among the cast, a fallen rope, and now a glove bearing the same name. It suggests someone is staging a drama of their own. He walked slowly along the stage's edge, his eyes tracing the hanging curtains and ropes, each one swaying just slightly with the draught from unseen vents. Then abruptly he turned and descended the wooden steps at the side of the proscenium arch. We must speak to the manager of this establishment post-haste. Now? At this hour? Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. We are more likely to find him in disarray and unguarded in his speech. It is a valuable window, Watson. Come. The watchman, Mr. Griggs, a barrel-chested man with a limp, had no desire to argue with the likes of Sherlock Holmes. He shuffled to the office in question and returned a few minutes later with a man trailing behind him, half-buttoned waistcoat and hair dishevelled with sleep. Mr. Lionel Plowman, the theatre manager, looked to be in his mid-50s, the kind of man who had once been trim and elegant, but whom the years of bills and backstage fires had worn to a shine. "Mr. Holmes," he said, squinting, "I was told you were investigating a whisper?" Holmes inclined his head, then gestured toward the main stage. "I should like to ask a few questions about a woman named Miriam Wells." Plowman blinked, then gave a thin, uncertain smile. "Good heavens, that's a name I haven't heard in some years." "So it is known to you," Holmes said smoothly. "Would you be so kind as to tell us who she was, and why her name might still haunt your theatre?" The manager sighed and leaned against a pillar, as if the gravity of memory required support. Miriam Wells was an actress, a leading lady here, in fact, nearly 10 years ago. She had the stage presence of Bernhardt and the temperament of a Tempest. Audiences adored her. She starred in a dozen plays, until the scandal. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Ah, scandal." "Of course," Plowman muttered. "There's always one. She was engaged to our then-producer, a Mr. Anthony Kelmar, a man of deep pockets and shallow morals. One night, a performance was cancelled abruptly. Lights out, house cleared, nothing said. Rumours swirled for days. Kelmar left town the following week. Miss Wells was never seen again." "Disappeared?" I asked. "Voluntarily. She left no farewell, no forwarding address. Some said she'd eloped with Kelmar. Others whispered she was ruined, or worse. A body was found weeks later in the river, but it wasn't hers. Still, the story faded." Holmes turned and paced a slow circle around the manager. "Miss Carville tells me no one in your company today bears the name Miriam, yet the voice she heard used it. And this glove was found behind the curtain just this morning." He held it up. Plowman's face paled slightly. "That's her glove. I'd stake my reputation on it. She wore those in La Sylphide, a short-lived production we closed early. That's impossible." "On the contrary," Holmes said, his tone hardening, "it is entirely deliberate. Someone wants us to think of Miss Wells. The question is, why now?" Plowman swallowed. "We've just received an offer," he said quietly. "A new investor. The theatre's been struggling. If something should mar our reputation—" Holmes stepped in close. "An interesting detail to volunteer, Mr. Plowman. And who, may I ask, is this investor?" "A Mr. Sterling Vane," he replied. "He's an industrialist, quiet fellow. Seen a few shows, offered to help refurbish the theatre and back a new production. He prefers not to be named on posters." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Very well. I will require a list of your current company, every actor and actress, including understudies, as well as your staff. Also, I would appreciate access to the theatre's archives, particularly the materials relating to La Sylphide. I'll have it sent up to you at once." "No need," Holmes said crisply. "We shall remain. I find the theatre particularly instructive when it is empty." Later that morning, we sat amidst the theatre's dusty archives, which occupied a small upper room near the lighting gallery. Holmes moved methodically through old programs, costume ledgers, cast lists. It was not long before he pulled a folder marked La Sylphide, 1883. "Watson," he murmured, "observe." He handed me a page, a yellowed cast sheet. There, among the names, was Miriam Wells, listed as the enchanted bride. Beside her name was a faint pencil annotation, absconded, closing early. M replaced by E. Winter. I stared. E. Winter? Could that be? Holmes tapped the sheet. "Eliza Winter, the current star of The Flight of Camilla. That is no coincidence." He stood and began pacing once more. "So," he mused aloud, "Miss Wells disappears. The show ends abruptly, the producer vanishes, yet the understudy, Miss Winter, suddenly steps into the spotlight. Now, Years later, her old understudy, Lenora Carville, is rehearsing late at night and hears a whisper meant to echo a buried secret. Someone wants the past exhumed. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was the watchman, hat in hand. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but I found something else this morning. I didn't think much of it till now. It's from under the trap door near the back of the stage. An old cloak, torn and damp. Looks like it's been there a while. Might be naught but junk." Holmes took the cloak, inspecting it silently. Then from the inner lining, he withdrew a crumpled envelope. He flattened it gently. It bore no stamp, only a name. Eliza Winter. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet. In delicate, angular handwriting it read, "You took everything, but the stage remembers what you stole. One night soon I shall take my bow." Holmes stood still, the paper fluttering in his fingers. "This," he said softly, "is no longer merely a ghost story. It is a warning. The stage is being set again, and this time the final act will not be cancelled." He looked at me, eyes gleaming with that peculiar fire he wore only when a mystery crossed the threshold from curiosity into danger. "Come, Watson, it is time we paid Miss Eliza Winter a visit." And with that we descended the narrow stair, leaving the shadows of the past behind us, for now. Eliza Winter lived in a townhouse on Berry Street, a stone's throw from St. James's, the kind of respectable address that whispered of well-maintained appearances and careful reputations. A neat brass knocker gleamed on the black-painted door, and the curtains in every window hung just so, neither extravagant nor frugal. It was a house that drew no attention, and yet Holmes paused before ringing, his eyes scanning the facade with meticulous attention. "She lives alone," he said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion. "No smoke from the upper chimneys, no live-in help. The boxwood along the front is trimmed recently but unevenly, maintained without affection." He rapped once, sharp and firm, and within a moment the door opened. Eliza Winter stood before us, half expectant, half wary. She was a woman who had once been dazzling and now carried that memory carefully in her carriage. Her eyes were dark and cool, the colour of aged ink, and her mouth was carefully composed, though not unfriendly. She wore a loose robe over a morning dress, and though not a hair was out of place, there was something behind her poise, a brittle tension, as if she were bracing for a line not yet delivered. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I thought perhaps you might call." Holmes gave a slight bow. "Then you were already aware of the whisper?" A faint flinch. "Miss Carville told me. She was quite shaken." "And you were not?" Holmes asked lightly. "I was surprised," she admitted. "The theatre attracts superstition like dust. Everyone thinks the stage is haunted by someone." "She heard the name Miriam." Eliza's eyes flickered. "Yes," she said carefully. "I suppose it's no surprise that name would resurface. The theatre has a long memory." Holmes stepped inside without being invited, one of his small but effective discourtesies. I followed. We were led into a parlour where daylight filtered through drawn curtains, casting the furniture in quiet sepia. A painting of a weeping willow hung above the fireplace, and beside it, on a sideboard, sat a small silver hand mirror face down. Holmes took a seat with unhurried grace. "Tell me, Miss Winter, what do you recall of Miriam Wells?" She gave a laugh, dry and without mirth. "Enough to know she vanished before her time. More than enough to know that none of us understood her fully. You replaced her. I was the understudy. The show needed a lead. I stepped in. There was nothing sinister in that." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Yet the production ended soon after." "Too soon," she said, and her voice faltered. "It was Miriam's show, I knew that. The audience never quite forgave the switch. We closed early." She left no note? No, she said, and her hands twisted in her lap. Not to me, she simply vanished. Some said she ran off with Mr. Kelmar, others believed she was dismissed quietly for misconduct. What did you believe? Eliza met Holmes's eyes. I believe something frightened her. She was not the kind of woman to run without cause. She carried secrets. All actresses do, but hers were heavier. Such as? There was a long pause. She had a visitor once, Eliza said at last. A man, not part of the theatre. He came during rehearsals, spoke to her in a hushed voice behind the curtains. She was pale afterward, ashen. I asked who he was. She said only, "The man I ran from." Holmes leaned forward. Would you recognize him again? I never saw his face. Just a shape, a heavy-set man. Gloves even in summer. Did she speak of him again? Once. She said if he came back there'd be no second escape. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he removed the envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She opened it, read, and the blood visibly drained from her face. "This was left for you," Holmes said quietly. "Backstage, hidden beneath the trapdoor." Eliza set the note down with a trembling hand. "No one else knew," she whispered. "No one knew about the glove. Or the line, the stage remembers." That's what she used to say when we rehearsed scenes badly. The stage remembers what you steal. Holmes's voice was measured. "So, you believe this was written by Miriam?" I don't know. It's her turn of phrase, but she's been gone for 10 years. It can't be." Holmes stood. "I believe someone wants you to think it's her. Whether they believe it themselves is another matter. One last thing, Miss Winter. Do you still have any of Miriam's belongings?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. One box, costumes and letters. I didn't throw it away. I suppose I felt it was wrong to." "May I?" She led us to a hallway closet where, beneath a hat box and an umbrella stand, she drew out a lacquered case with worn corners. Inside were 2 faded scripts, a small scent bottle, and several neatly folded letters tied with blue ribbon. Holmes sifted through them silently. One he withdrew and turned toward the window to read. "Watson," he murmured. "This one's addressed to Anthony Kelmar." He read aloud. "I cannot keep performing when I know he is in the audience. It's like drowning behind a smile. I fear the past has caught me, and I can only pretend so long. If I disappear, tell Eliza it was not her fault. She only stood in my light because I stepped away from it." He folded it back. Poetic, but also a confession of sorts. Eliza's voice was low. "That letter was never sent. I don't think she ever meant it to be." Holmes turned to me. "We must find Anthony Kelmar." I frowned. "You said he left London. Is he still alive?" Holmes looked out at the grey morning beyond the curtain. "That is what we must now determine, for if he is, then the man in the wings, the whisperer, may well be him, and if he is not, then we may be chasing a ghost with teeth." We thanked Miss Winter and departed into the growing bustle of the London day. Holmes hailed a cab and instructed the driver to take us to the offices of the Era, the theatrical publication which catalogued the movements and misfortunes of every actor and impresario in the city. "Watson, I have a theory," he said as we rode. "This is not merely a ghost story, nor a simple case of vengeance. This is a performance, a layered one. Someone is reconstructing the stage of 10 years past. They are invoking memory as misdirection. There is a pattern to this, and I intend to find its rhythm." At the Era offices, a clerk with ink-stained cuffs and a fondness for gossip retrieved a dusty ledger. After a brief perusal, Holmes pointed to an entry dated 1884. "Anthony Kelmar," he read, "left for the continent after financial mismanagement claims at Pavilion Theatre, cited in Brussels, no return recorded. No death notice either, I observed. Indeed, but the absence of death does not confirm life. Still, it gives us a place to start. Holmes drummed his fingers on the desk. Next stop, Watson, the Department of Records. If Mr. Kelmar ever set foot again on English soil, they will know. And, if not, then someone else is pretending he did. Either way, the curtain has lifted, and this time we will not leave before the final bow. And with that, we stepped once more into the labyrinth of London, where shadows walked with purpose, and memory played its cruelest tricks beneath the footlights. The Department of Records, housed in a grey stone building just off Somerset House, possessed the lifeless hush of a place too burdened by facts to accommodate curiosity. Holmes moved through its corridors like a man in his element, bypassing clerks with curt nods and presenting a neatly written request for access to international re-entry logs and immigration ledgers from the past decade. His name opened doors. Within 15 minutes we were seated at a long oak table in a side room, surrounded by ledgers thick as paving stones. Holmes paged through them with rhythmic precision, scanning columns of names and arrival stamps, each line a whisper from the past. I busied myself with older registers, though I confess my eyes drifted more than once to the rain-slicked window and the lamplight that burned behind it. The weight of the case, its sense of haunting not just in memory, but in intention, pressed like fog at the back of my thoughts. At last, Holmes paused and tapped a page. "Here," he murmured. "August 1891, a man travelling under the name Anton Keller," note the similarity. "Arriving from Antwerp, destination listed as London, no recorded departure afterward. The name is too close for coincidence and too obscure for accident." "Do you believe it's Kelmar under a pseudonym?" "I do," Holmes replied. "Kelmar always fancied himself elusive. Changing a few letters in his name would satisfy both his ego and his need for discretion." He made a note in his pocketbook. "We now possess 3 knowns. Kelmar fled London in disgrace. Miriam Wells vanished shortly after. Now someone returns under a fractured name, Anton Keller, and stirs the coals of a fire nearly cold. If Kelmar is alive, he may have returned not in secrecy, but with a plan." "Why now?" I asked. "Why 10 years later?" Holmes closed the ledger and stood. "Revenge, perhaps, or guilt twisted into retribution, or, most likely, because something has changed, something that makes this the precise moment to act." As we emerged into the street, the drizzle had hardened into honest rain, and the gas lamps hissed faintly against the mist. Holmes hailed another cab and gave a new address, one that puzzled me at first. "Leadenhall Market?" I asked. He nodded. "You'll recall Mr. Plowman mentioned a new investor in the Pavilion Theatre, a man named Sterling Vane. I took the liberty of having his name traced while we were at Records. He's not a known patron of the arts, but he is the proprietor of a small but rapidly expanding import business operating from Leadenhall." The ride was brief. The market, typically lively with merchants and chatter, stood half quiet in the rain, its iron arches beaded with water and its tiled floors dark with boot marks. We found Vane's office tucked behind a haberdasher's, its door brass-plated and anonymous. Holmes rapped 3 times. A man in his early 60s opened the door. Neatly dressed with slick grey hair and a gold watch chain, he had the look of someone who did not enjoy surprises. "Yes," he said sharply. "Mr. Sterling Vane?" Holmes asked. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. May we have a few moments of your time?" Vane's eyes narrowed. "What is this concerning?" "The Pavilion Theatre," Holmes said smoothly. "And a mutual acquaintance, Anthony Kelmar." Vane's expression didn't flicker, precisely what made it interesting. "I'm afraid I don't know that name," he said. "And I haven't any dealings with detectives." Holmes tilted his head as though in curiosity. Then I wonder why Kelmar's last known address in England matches the building behind your name. Silence. Then Vane opened the door wider. Come in, briefly. The office was sparse. A few ledgers, a brass clock ticking audibly, and a decanter of port sat unopened on a side table. Holmes declined the offer of a seat, standing instead by the window with one hand behind his back. You're not an investor in the arts, he said evenly. You're a front. Your business is real enough, but its profits don't quite explain your sudden interest in the pavilion. Tell me, was it guilt that brought you back? Or necessity? Vane's jaw clenched. You presume a great deal, Mr. Holmes. I infer, Holmes corrected. There is a difference. You see, Miriam Wells vanished the same week Anthony Kelmar disappeared with a sum of investor money and the scandal of a ruined show behind him. Yet no charges were ever filed, no body recovered. Now, 10 years on, a whisper behind a curtain begins a sequence of unsettling echoes. Eliza Winter receives a threatening letter referencing a private saying only Miriam would have known, and in the theatre a black glove reappears, deliberately planted. You see, someone is reconstructing the past, not merely remembering it. Vane's hand tightened around the decanter's neck. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Are you Anthony Kelmar, Mr. Vane? The silence that followed was long enough for the rain to grow audible again against the windows. Then the man gave a weary exhale. I was, he said at last, but I buried that name years ago. Watson stiffened. Then you admit— I admit nothing of the sort, Vane cut in. Yes, I fled London, but I did not kill Miriam. I loved her. Holmes's tone was glacial. Yet you left without her. She asked me to, Vane said. You don't understand. The investors were closing in. There was a fraud accusation, and I was facing ruin. She told me to go. She said she'd follow once the theatre had recovered, but she never came. Holmes's eyes darkened. You expect us to believe that? She wrote to me, Vane said quickly. Once, then never again. I waited in Brussels for nearly a year. Eventually I returned under another name. Built a new life. I never saw her again. Holmes produced the letter from Eliza Winter's house. Did you write this? Vane read it and gave a strangled laugh. Number, good God, no, this isn't my hand. And I'd never threaten Eliza. She is innocent. Then who would want to frame you? Holmes asked. Vane hesitated. There was another man, years ago, a stagehand named Breck. He was infatuated with Miriam, obsessed even. She dismissed him once, and he didn't take it well. I had him let go quietly. He threatened her once backstage. I don't know what became of him, but he hated me, and he hated her. Holmes turned to me. Watson, take that down. Breck, employed at the Pavilion 10 years ago, let go after an incident. Then he looked to Vane. I don't believe you've told us everything, but what you have shared may be useful. You'd be wise not to leave London. As we stepped back into the chill air, Holmes moved quickly, cloak flaring behind him. We must return to the Pavilion. If Breck is involved, if he never left, then the theatre may be more than haunted. It may be hiding its ghost in plain sight. The rain quickened. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, and behind the curtain, someone waited for their cue. By the time we reached the Pavilion Theatre once more, the afternoon gloom had deepened into a melancholy dusk. The gaslights flared fitfully against the rising mist, and the theatre loomed ahead like a slumbering beast in wait. Holmes led the way with determined haste, the long strides of his coat slicing through the thickening air, as though it, too, resisted the notion of our return. Inside, the theatre was all but empty.
A janitor with a push broom nodded as we passed, but otherwise the great belly of the building lay hushed and hollow, as though it remembered something dreadful. Holmes made for the stage without pause, pausing only to glance toward the trap-door where the cloak and letter had been found. He crouched at its edge, running his gloved fingers along the grain of the wood, pausing now and then to tap lightly with the back of his knuckles. "It's odd," he said softly. "What is?" "This section of the floor has been re-oiled recently, but only this portion, precisely 3 feet square around the trap-door. The rest of the boards remain dry and weathered." I stepped closer. "To hide something?" "To clean something," Holmes replied. "Something that spilled. Not blood, or it would stain. Something like oil, perhaps lamp fuel. But why here?" He stood and crossed to the far end of the wings, where the ropes and rigging formed a tangled canopy above us. He gestured upward. "Observe that pulley, Watson, the one directly above where the rope fell. The one Miss Carville mentioned. It's been restrung." I followed his gaze. "You're certain?" "The rope is newer, lighter in color. It hasn't yet settled into the dust of its companions. Someone replaced it after the fall." "But why?" "To cover their tracks. To erase the mark of a tampered line, a staging ground for a false accident, perhaps to draw attention, or to hide something else entirely." Holmes turned toward the darkened hallway leading backstage. "Come, I want to see the crew roster. If Breck was employed here 10 years ago, there's a chance he never left. Or perhaps he returned under another name, as Kelmar did. In the manager's office, we found a ledger of staff names listing positions from lighting engineers to prop masters." Holmes's fingers flew across the columns, eyes narrowing as he scanned. "There, look at this." He pointed to a name near the bottom. "George Beale, assistant rigger. Employed intermittently since 1882. I frowned. "That isn't Breck." "Indeed not, but the handwriting is inconsistent. Look closely, see the B in Beale? It's overwritten faintly, as though correcting something. The original name could well have been Breck." Holmes snapped the ledger shut. "We must speak to him, now." It took several minutes to locate him. A stagehand informed us that old Beale slept in a small room off the south hallway, a concession granted to him long ago in lieu of full wages. We followed the corridor to its far end and found a narrow door nearly flush with the plaster. Holmes rapped once, twice. No answer. He tried the latch, unlocked. Inside was a cramped chamber, barely larger than a wardrobe, a cot, a chest, a cracked wash basin, a half-empty oil lamp still smouldered on the shelf. The air held the tang of old rope, mould, and something less definable, an unease, perhaps. The room was empty, but not abandoned. On the cot lay a dark coat, threadbare but recently worn. In the corner, propped against the wall, was a stage mask, tragic, painted white, its edges chipped, and atop the chest sat a sheaf of pages, scribbled over in wild, uneven hand. Holmes moved to them instantly, reading the topmost sheet in silence. I joined him, and together we looked at the frenzied scrawl. "She took the light. I gave her everything. The boards never forget. The whisper is real. They said I was nothing, but she heard me. She heard me. She hears me still. She waits behind the curtain, watching them lie. I only have to pull the rope again and again and again." Holmes folded the paper and placed it in his coat. "We're running out of time," he said. "Do you think he's planning something? Another accident? Number something far more deliberate. He believes Miriam still lingers, haunts even. But I think it is he who has become the ghost, obsessed, fixated, and now, I suspect, dangerous." He turned sharply toward the hallway. "Watson, we must find Miss Winter. She is the—"
Next target. We hurried through the passages of the theatre, retracing our steps toward the dressing rooms. Rehearsal had ended, and the corridors were quiet, save for the muffled sound of footsteps overhead. Holmes pushed open each door with increasing urgency. Finally, near the green room, we found her. Eliza Winter stood at her mirror, touching her hair with absent fingers. She turned as we entered, startled, though not entirely surprised. "Mr. Holmes, there's no time to explain. You must leave the theatre immediately." Her face paled. "What's happened?" "Breck, under the name George Beale, is here. He's unstable and convinced you are part of a betrayal. He may be armed. Do you understand me?" She hesitated. "But I can't. There's a rehearsal tonight." "There won't be if we're correct," Holmes said. "Watson, take her out the stage door. I'll find Griggs and lock down the upper galleries. Go now." I nodded and reached for Miss Winter's arm. She followed me without protest, her expression white with fright but composed. We moved swiftly through the back corridor toward the side exit. Just as we turned the corner, a loud creak echoed from above, the groan of old wood, and then a sudden snap. Holmes's voice rang out, sharp and echoing. "Watson, duck!" I pulled Miss Winter hard against the wall as a heavy sandbag came crashing down from the fly space above, striking the floor where we'd been moments before. The dust burst upward in a choking cloud. Footsteps fled above. Holmes was already in motion. "He's heading to the rafters. Go!" I shoved the door open, ushering Miss Winter out into the alley. "Stay here. Do not move until I return," I said. And without waiting for a reply, I turned and followed Holmes into the depths of the theatre once more. He had taken the back stairs 2 at a time, coat flying, and by the time I reached the lighting gallery, I found him crouched by the final ladder to the catwalk. "He's up there," Holmes whispered, cornered. A soft scuffle echoed above. Holmes climbed first, silent as breath. I followed, heart hammering with each rung. The catwalk stretched across the theatre ceiling, a narrow iron bridge suspended high above the stage. Shadows clung thickly here, and the smell of oil and dust was suffocating. At the far end stood a hunched figure, back to us, muttering. "You lied," the voice hissed. "You said she'd come back. You said she'd see me again." "Mr. Breck," Holmes said calmly, taking a step forward. "It's over." The man spun. He was gaunt, almost spectral, with hollow cheeks and eyes too wide. In his hand, a length of rope swung idly like a pendulum. "You don't know," he whispered. "You never knew her? I heard her. She's still here. She talks to me when they sleep." "She is gone," Holmes said gently. "And what you're hearing is your memory, twisted by time. You want justice, but—"
"This is not justice. This is madness." The rope stilled. For a moment, Breck trembled, then slowly his arms slackened. The rope dropped. "I only wanted her to stay." Holmes stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Let's bring you down." And quietly, miraculously, the ghost descended. Below, the curtain stirred gently, and somewhere in the theatre's darkness the final act awaited. By the time Breck reached the ground, the theatre had fallen into a silence deeper than any applause could break. Holmes and I flanked him carefully as he stepped from the final rung of the ladder, his hands slack, his face gaunt with years of obsession and ruin. The rope he had carried dangled like a failed thought from his fingers, and I couldn't help but wonder what darker performance he had been rehearsing in the rafters before Holmes interrupted it. We guided him into the green room, now emptied of its usual hum of stage chatter. Holmes instructed the watchman to summon Inspector Lestrade with a quiet urgency I had not heard in some time. Breck sat without protest on a low wooden bench, staring at the floor. He neither trembled nor resisted. He simply stared, as if the very shape of the world had failed him. Holmes paced the room for a moment, then drew a chair directly across from the man and sat. "You were never going to kill her?" Holmes said calmly. You intended to scare her, to recreate the scene, a final act with you as playwright and ghost. She forgot, Breck whispered. They all forgot, but not the stage, not her voice. Holmes nodded. That voice never left you, did it? You heard her even when the curtains were drawn. She came back once, Breck said, his voice almost childlike. A week after he left, I saw her standing there. She wore the black gloves, said nothing, but she looked at me. Holmes glanced at me, then back to Breck. She didn't disappear entirely, did she? Breck's eyes glistened. They all said she left with Kelmar, but she didn't. She was afraid. She hid. In the theatre? He nodded. I gave her the key to the room beneath the trapdoor. No one used it, not since the fire 20 years ago. I stiffened. There's a room under the stage. Breck nodded again, slower this time. She said she needed time. Time to think. She wrote letters. I brought her food, clothes, then one night she was gone. No note, just the glove. Holmes leaned back. And you never told anyone? No one would have believed me, Breck said softly. They already called me odd. She trusted me. But she left, like the rest. Holmes steepled his fingers. And you believed she never left the theatre? I hoped. When Eliza returned, I thought, maybe. His voice cracked then, and he fell silent, shaking his head. Holmes rose and crossed to the door. Griggs, he called, bring a lantern. The watchman returned quickly, the flickering light casting wild shadows
across the floor. Holmes took the lantern in one hand, gestured for me with the other, and turned to Breck. Show us. We followed him back to the stage. The boards creaked under our feet, and as Breck knelt before the trapdoor, I saw his fingers hesitate, tremble, not with fear but reverence. He pried it open with surprising care, revealing a narrow shaft beneath, lined with crumbling brick. A black iron ladder led downward into darkness. Holmes handed me the lantern and descended first, the metal rungs groaning under his weight. I followed, each step colder than the last. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small cellar no larger than a parlour. The air was stale and thick with dust. The remains of a broken chair lay in one corner, a pile of worn costumes in another. There was a small writing desk tucked against the far wall. Holmes approached it immediately. On the surface sat a stack of envelopes, neatly bound with ribbon now browned with age. He lifted the top letter and read the front. To be delivered only if I am not seen again. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, precise. Miriam Wells, Holmes said aloud. He opened the letter slowly, eyes scanning each line. I watched as his features tightened, then softened, then stilled. She was pregnant, he said. This letter was meant for Kelmar. She wrote that she couldn't follow him, not while carrying his child. She was afraid of what he'd do. She feared he would deny it, destroy her reputation further. She planned to leave quietly. Start again. I took a step forward. But she never mailed the letter? No, Holmes said, his voice distant. She left it here, along with everything else. He lifted a small pouch beside the stack, jewelry, stage trinkets, even a miniature photograph of Miriam herself. The same face we had seen in a decades-old program, now captured in soft sepia. Holmes set the items down gently. She left the theatre, he said. She didn't die here. This room was a chrysalis. She emerged somewhere else. New name, new life. Breck never knew. That's why he waited. I looked around the cellar again, the low ceiling pressing close. And no one came down here in 10 years? Apparently not, Holmes replied. It was sealed by neglect, like the memory of the woman who once called it refuge. From above we heard the creak of floorboards. A voice echoed faintly, Lestrade's unmistakable bark. Holmes nodded toward the ladder. "Come, Watson, let us return to the living." We ascended slowly. Holmes handed the letters to Lestrade the moment we stepped back onto the stage. "There will be no charge of attempted murder," he said. "Breck may be mad, but not malevolent. He requires care, not chains. See to it he is taken to St. Dunstan's infirmary for observation." Lestrade, used to Holmes's pronouncements, merely nodded. "What of the letters?" "They belong to Miss Winter now," Holmes said. "She knew."
Miriam best, and perhaps they'll tell her what we cannot. Later, we walked the length of the theatre once more, Holmes with hands clasped behind his back, I beside him, subdued. "Will you tell Miss Carville?" I asked. "Some," Holmes said. "Enough to lift the fear, but not the full tale. Not all ghosts should be exorcised. Some must remain, quiet and known only to a few." "And what of Kelmar?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Let him remain vain. There's more justice in being haunted by who you were than in punishment. The stage already cast him in the role of coward. He will carry it longer than any prison term." We reached the foot of the stage stairs. Holmes turned, looked once more into the wings. "She vanished, Watson, but not from the world. Only from those who didn't truly see her. She left signs for those who listened." He touched the velvet curtain beside him. "And someone always does." We stepped out into the cold night. The mist had thinned, and the stars now pricked through the clouds like faint stage lights from beyond. Behind us, the pavilion stood still once more, and somewhere beneath its floorboards, a whisper that had echoed too long had finally fallen silent. We did not speak for some time after leaving the Pavilion Theatre. The rhythm of our boots on the cobblestones, softened by the lingering damp, was the only sound that accompanied us through the fading night. Holmes's face was unreadable as we crossed into Baker Street, and though I had long grown accustomed to his silences, this one carried a peculiar weight. Less the silence of deduction, more the silence that follows a curtain fall. Back in our sitting room, he shrugged off his coat and stood before the fireplace. He did not light it, though the chill warranted it. He simply stood, gazing at the empty grate as though it contained the remnants of something unseen. "She lived," he said at last. "She disappeared, yes, but not as a victim. That matters, Watson." "It does," I agreed. "But the question remains. Where did she go?" Holmes turned to me slowly, the old fire kindling faintly behind his eyes. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must now uncover." I looked at him in some surprise. "You mean to find her?" "Not because she is a threat or in danger, but because her story is incomplete. We have the first acts, and we have the final scene they tried to write without her, but we lack the interlude. And within that interlude, I suspect, lies the true resolution to this strange play." He moved to his desk and retrieved a slim notebook. "The letters she left were never posted, which means she likely feared interception, or had reason not to trust the addresses. But she would not have left without preparing for her safety. She was a woman accustomed to masks, an actress, and no actress walks off stage without knowing where her next one will be worn." He handed me the notebook, opened to a page that
read Miriam Wells, last known roles, La Sylphide, The Glass Kiss, The Red Lark, touring credits, Edinburgh, Bath, Brighton. "We begin with the touring company," he said. "Somewhere on that circuit, she may have planted roots, disguised as someone new, or perhaps only partially altered. The theatre world, Watson, is more loyal to its mysteries than to truth. If she wished to vanish, it would have harboured her, without question." We began the next day in Brighton, the southernmost of her known haunts, where the sea air mixed with the scent of salt and ink from the countless seaside printers churning out broadsheets and programs. Holmes, as was his habit, attacked the problem laterally. Rather than inquire at the theatres themselves, he began at the Public Records Office. People change names, he said as he rifled through stacks of civic registers, but rarely abandon their professions. If she married, we might find a record. If she acted, even under another name, someone would have paid her. And there, in a listing from 1884, he found it. Watson, look here. He handed me a small flyer. Theatre Royal, Bath. Production, The Widow's Cipher. Lead, Miss Marion Wells. Marion, Holmes said softly. A common variation, but note the spelling. Wells, not Wells. A drop of the E, just enough to fade into obscurity. We took the next train to Bath. There we tracked down the theatre's archivist, a genial fellow with an encyclopedic memory of casts long since vanished. Miss Wells, he repeated when Holmes inquired. Oh yes, I remember her. Quiet woman. Fine diction. Not overly ambitious, but dependable. Played here for nearly 2 seasons. Left. Suddenly said she was taking a position in York, but we never received the forwarding information. Did she leave anything behind? Holmes asked. Notes, letters, contracts? The archivist scratched his head. Not much. But there was a sketch. One of the stage painters did it. Said she had an interesting profile. He returned a moment later with a small, dust-coated canvas. It depicted a woman in profile, seated, her eyes turned downward in thought. The shape of the face, the mouth, the long neck. I recognized it instantly. It's her, I said. Holmes nodded. And that's all we need. He turned back to the archivist. Did anyone else leave the company when she did? Now that you mention it, yes. A young actress named Eleanor D. Close to her, I think. They lodged together, if memory serves. That gave Holmes his next lead. He found Eleanor D. listed as the current matron of a modest girls' conservatory near Chiswick. We travelled there that evening, our path guided now by instinct as much as deduction. When Eleanor opened the door and saw the sketch Holmes held, her lips parted, but she did not speak. She's alive, Holmes said simply. We only wish to know that she found peace. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside. She led us to a small sitting room sparsely decorated with a vase of dried roses on the mantel. She sat across from us and folded her hands in her lap. She called herself Marion then, she said. She wanted to forget, but she never could. She left a great deal behind, I said gently. I know, I was there. She told me some of it. Kelmar, the humiliation, the fear. She didn't trust the man who offered her escape. She feared the press would find her. So she left even me, in the end. She vanished again? Holmes asked. Eleanor nodded. One day she simply left a note. It said only, if I stay too long, the stage will find me. That was 10 years ago. I never heard from her again. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever speak of a child? A pause. Eleanor's eyes welled slightly. Yes, she said. A daughter. Born in secret. She named her Eliza. I sat back. Eliza Winter. Eleanor smiled sadly. She arranged for the child to be adopted by a family of actors. She thought it poetic. The girl would grow in the world she had loved, but from a safe distance. She never told her, of course. She thought it would be cruel. Holmes sat very still. She watched her now and then, Eleanor added. From the audience. I saw her once at the pavilion, cloaked, when Eliza took her first bow as leading lady. We remained in silence for a moment. She died some years later, Eleanor said finally. Pneumonia, in a boarding house in Leeds. I received a letter from the landlady. Marion had written my name on the envelope before she passed. Holmes stood and bowed his head. Then her story ends with choice, not tragedy. She was never bitter, Eleanor said, "only quiet." She had loved the stage, but the stage had never learned to love her properly in return. That night, back in London, Holmes did not speak for some time. He sat with his violin under his chin but played no note, only stared out the window at the rain. I poured 2 brandies. "You solved it," I said, "from curtain rise to final bow." He nodded slowly. "But not all cases are solved for justice, Watson. Some are solved for memory." And in the theatre of our minds, the last spotlight faded. The fire in our Baker Street hearth had burned to a low amber glow by the time Holmes stirred from his long silence. He rose at last from his chair with the stiffness of a man coming back from a far distance, not in miles, but in time. He moved to the window where the London mist pressed gently against the panes, blurring gaslight and shadow alike. "She stood there once, Watson," he murmured. Miriam, watching from the dark as her daughter took the stage. It must have been a peculiar triumph, not applause but presence, not a bow but the absence of collapse. I nodded, though his tone required no response. Holmes had always reserved his deepest reflections for the margins of a case when all facts had fallen into place, but something beyond the solution still lingered. "There remains a final matter," he said quietly, turning back to me. "One we have not yet addressed." "What's that?" "The letter," he replied. "The one left for Eliza Winter, the veiled threat referencing the stage, the theft, the return. It was not written by Breck. The hand does not match, nor does the language, and Breck's fixation, while severe, was never rooted in vengeance. His was a clinging delusion, not a plan." I sat up straighter. "You think someone else forged it?" "I am certain of it," Holmes said, already moving toward his desk. "Which begs the question, who would benefit from provoking fear in Miss Winter? Who would benefit from unearthing the memory of Miriam Wells, just as the pavilion prepares to rise again with new capital and fresh leadership?" He produced a small stack of documents from a file box. Theatre finances, personnel lists, investor briefings. He had, as always, been collecting quietly as the case had unfolded. "Sterling Vane," I offered. "Kelmar, he had more reason than most." "Vane wished to stay hidden," Holmes said, "and in truth I believe he still does. His guilt is passive, remorse dressed in resignation. No, Watson, the person we seek is not hiding. They are claiming, reclaiming something they believe was taken." He flipped open the pavilion's internal schedule. "Note the casting for the next production. Eliza is slated to star again. The Death of Persephone, directed by one Harold Fenwick." The name rang faintly. I searched my memory. "Fenwick," Holmes said, anticipating my question, "was a playwright and assistant director during the final years of Miriam Wells's career. He wrote The Red Lark, a vehicle for her talents. It closed in disgrace when she vanished, and Fenwick never recovered his reputation." Holmes handed me a faded clipping from the Era, dated 1884. "The disappearance of Miss Wells marks the second production collapse for Fenwick this year. Rumours abound regarding unprofessional tensions backstage. The playwright declined to comment." "He was embittered," Holmes said, "and quiet. Never publicly accused, never exonerated. He drifted, until now, when suddenly he resurfaces at the pavilion and places Miss Winter at the centre of his next play." "You think he wrote the threatening letter?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "The phrasing is theatrical, the cadence rehearsed, a writer's construction. It mimics vengeance but plays like a script." He rose again, reaching for his coat. "We must speak to him before rehearsals begin. I do not trust his intentions, not with Eliza, and not with what remains of the story he believes was stolen from him." We arrived at the pavilion shortly after dawn. The theatre smelled of varnish and dust. the air still heavy with the phantom echoes of a century's worth of lines. Stagehands moved with quiet urgency, runners coiling ropes, carpenters adjusting flats, each oblivious to the undercurrents we'd come to trace. Fenwick was in the director's room, seated with a script in his lap, making annotations in dense red pencil. He was a tall, angular man with iron-grey hair swept back in a wave, and eyes that flickered with a controlled intensity. When he looked up and saw Holmes, his expression tightened, but he did not rise. "I expected you would come," he said, voice even. "You've been circling this place like a crow." "I've been circling the truth," Holmes replied, "and you've built a fine scaffold of illusions around it." Fenwick closed the script with a precise motion. "You want to ask about the letter? Very well. Yes, I wrote it." I blinked. "You admit it?" "Why wouldn't I?" he said coolly. "It's a metaphor, a provocation, a necessary bit of drama to shake Miss Winter from her complacency. She walks the boards, but she has no depth. She plays strength, but she lacks shadow. I wanted her afraid for a moment, to reach something real." Holmes stepped forward. "So, you admit to threatening her?" "Not threatening," Fenwick replied, with the air of a man correcting a student. "Inspiring. Fear sharpens the blade. I never intended harm." "You manipulated her using the ghost of her mother," Holmes said, now with steel in his voice. "You used a dead woman's name, a private phrase, to awaken something you could control." Fenwick stood now, face colouring slightly. "And what if I did? Miriam was my muse, my ruin. No one asked me what her vanishing cost. I wrote her best roles. I bled them out of my spine. And then she left, no note, no closure. The audience forgot. But I remembered." "You remembered and you repurposed," Holmes said. "You shaped her into a fable. You fed Breck's madness and nearly sent Eliza into a breakdown. All for what? A better performance?" "A truer one," Fenwick said darkly. "Eliza is her daughter. I saw it the moment she auditioned. The voice, the breath, the way she tilts her chin before the first line. She is what Miriam left behind, but she's playing the role without knowing the script." Holmes stared at him. "She knows now," he said flatly. Fenwick blinked. "What?" "She knows Miriam was her mother," Holmes continued. "She knows the truth. Eleanor D. has spoken with her. She has read the letters." Fenwick's composure fractured just slightly. He sat back too quickly. That wasn't my intent." "No," Holmes said, "your intent was to direct a ghost. But ghosts don't follow stage directions. They walk their own cues. And now, Mr. Fenwick, you will withdraw from this production. You will publish a retraction of the letter, disguised, if you must, in the program notes. You will claim it was an abandoned plot device. You will let Miss Winter perform without your hand twisting the shadows around her." Fenwick was silent. Then finally he nodded. "I only wanted to finish the story." "You did," Holmes said coldly, "but you were not its author." Outside, the sun had begun to rise in earnest, casting thin gold across the empty stage. Holmes and I lingered a moment at the edge of the house, watching as a stage hand pulled the main curtain back. Dust danced in the beam of light like memory made visible. Eliza stood at center stage, alone, rehearsing a line in silence. "She knows now," I said. "How do you think she'll carry it?" "With grace," Holmes replied. "The stage remembers what you steal, but it also remembers what you restore." He turned, and we stepped back into the hush of morning. And behind us, the theatre began, once again, to breathe. We did not return to Baker Street directly after our final conversation with Harold Fenwick. Instead, Holmes suggested we walk. The early morning light spilled cautiously over the rooftops, gilding chimney pots and trembling across the puddled flagstones like something newly born. The streets had not yet filled with the noise of trade and traffic, and for a brief span of time London itself seemed to pause, holding its breath at the edge of day. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. I had grown to read such silences as I might read a long pause in a symphony. They were not empty, but laden with thought. He had resolved the case by any measurable standard, and yet I sensed there was something still unspoken, something he was weighing with unusual care. At last, as we crossed through Bloomsbury, he said, "You see, Watson, what haunts is not merely what was done, but what was left undone. Miriam Wells vanished, yes, but not only from the stage. She vanished from those who believed they owned part of her." I glanced over. "You mean Fenwick?" "I mean all of them. Kelmar, who wanted her devotion. Fenwick, who wanted her as character. Even Breck, who wanted her voice to remain in his head forever. They each wanted a piece of her. None of them understood that she had every right to disappear, every right to rewrite herself. And yet, I said, she left behind a daughter, one who never knew." Holmes gave a small, reflective nod. "And that was the one choice she questioned to the end, I suspect. You saw it in the letters, the restraint, the apology implied, rather than spoken. But even in that, she gave the girl a chance at a life free from scandal, free from the old machinery of reputation and debt." We turned onto a quieter lane. The gas lamps were still burning weakly in the pale light, stubborn in their duty. Holmes slowed, then stopped altogether. "I've written to Eliza," he said without turning. "She'll receive the full transcript of the case. Not the salacious parts, not the manipulations, only the truth that matters about her mother, her origins, the choice that saved her." I nodded. "And what of Breck?" "He is resting at St. Dunstan's," Holmes replied. "Dr. Marston believes his delusions will subside now that the mystery is broken. He was clinging to an illusion, not malice. And illusions, Watson, can sometimes be more enduring than hatred." We resumed our walk. The sound of a milk cart echoed faintly behind us, a mundane intrusion into the surreal echo of the past we had been wandering through. Holmes glanced skyward. The clouds were thinning, lifting as if a weight had been removed from the skyline itself. "There's one thread left," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "What thread?" Holmes turned his gaze toward me sharply, but not unkindly. "Eliza Winter knows the truth," he said, "but she has yet to decide what to do with it. That, Watson, is the final act, and I suspect we are not its audience." Later that morning, a letter arrived at Baker Street. The handwriting was clear, deliberate. The envelope bore the crest of the Pavilion Theatre. Holmes opened it, read it once, then handed it to me without comment. "Mr. Holmes, thank you. I read the letters. I visited the place beneath the stage. I sat for a long time beside the desk where she once breathed the only truth she could write. It is strange to speak of a woman I never met as though she were part of my skin, but I feel her there now, not in the way others wanted her to be, but in the way she left herself behind. I will go on with the production, but I will not use her name as performance. I will not make her a myth. She was real. That is enough. E. Winter." I folded the letter slowly. Holmes smiled, not with triumph, but with that rare, quiet grace I had only seen in him when something greater than logic had been restored. The days that followed settled into the ordinary rhythm of life at 221B. A case involving a counterfeit coin press took our attention for a time, as did a peculiar incident of botanical theft in Kew. Holmes resumed his late-night violin playing, and I resumed my notes, though for several evenings I found myself returning again to the memory of the stage, the curtain, and the voice that had never fully faded. But the case of Miriam Wells did not close with spectacle. It closed instead with silence. Not an empty silence, but the silence of a role finally finished. A woman allowed to leave, not in disgrace, but in choice, and another, her daughter, standing now in the light of that choice, not shadowed by legacy, but guided by its quiet courage. 1 week later, we received 2 tickets to the opening night of The Death of Persephone. The envelope bore no name, just the theatre's seal and a single pressed violet between the pages. Holmes declined the invitation. "It's not our story anymore," he said. And I understood. So I went alone. I sat in the 3rd row, just to the left of centre. The house was full, every seat occupied. The curtain rose, the lights dimmed, and there she stood, Eliza Winter, in full command
of the stage. She did not speak immediately. She stood in stillness, the moment hanging like a breath not yet released. And then she began. Her voice filled the hall, not trembling, not forced, but true. No ghost guided her now, only memory and something far more rare, grace, earned by knowing. I thought of Miriam then, not the vanished star, not the name scrawled in old programs, but the woman who once sat alone beneath the stage, writing the words she never spoke. And as the applause rang out, long and full and rising, I knew she had heard it at last. Wherever she had gone, wherever she remained. The house was still humming with applause when I stepped out into the cool night air. The pavilion's great brass doors swung shut behind me with a soft groan, and I paused beneath the awning, letting the echo of Eliza Winter's final scene settle somewhere in the chest. Less a memory than a resonance. Her performance had not mimicked Miriam Wells. It had not borrowed her cadence, nor resurrected her tragedy. It had rewritten it. A woman stepped out of the theatre just behind me, quietly, alone. She was middle-aged, with a worn shawl draped over her shoulders and eyes that did not blink as they scanned the street. She looked for a breath, like someone I had seen before, and then she vanished into the crowd, lost in the spill of departing patrons and the clatter of carriage wheels against cobblestone. London breathed around us again. I turned up my collar against the breeze and made my way back toward Baker Street, thinking I might find Holmes awake, pacing, already speaking aloud to himself in his usual fashion. But when I arrived, the sitting room was dim. Only the faint scent of tobacco lingered, and a single sheet of notepaper lay on the side table, folded once, precisely. Watson, gone out walking, no need to wait. H.H. It was not like Holmes to retreat once the bow was tied. He typically disdained finality. Conclusions, he once told me, were merely the briefest pause before an error or a resurrection. And yet something about this case had held him differently. Not by its danger, but by its silence. I poured myself a brandy, sat in his chair, and listened to the clock tick down the minutes. He returned just past midnight. There was no sound on the stairs, only the door opening quietly, followed by the scrape of his boots. He did not speak until he had removed his coat, set his walking stick aside, and settled into the chair opposite mine. She was there, he said at last, in the back row of the gallery, disguised, of course, a shawl, a veil, but I saw her. I frowned. Who? Miriam? He nodded slowly. But Eleanor D. said... Yes, I know what she said, but she was mistaken, or perhaps instructed to believe it. Miriam Wells did not die in Leeds. She disappeared again, further, cleaner. I suspect she faked her death, or allowed it to be misunderstood. Either way, she survived. Then why come back?
Now? Holmes did not answer for a long time. He leaned forward, poured himself a brandy, and swirled it once before taking a single, contemplative sip. "I believe she came to see whether Eliza was herself," he said finally. "Not whether she was a mirror, not whether she could carry the voice, but whether she had become a woman of her own choosing." She stayed to the final bow, then left through the alley precisely as she had the first time. This time, no one followed. Except me. "You spoke to her?" "No." "You let her go?" Holmes's eyes met mine. "Yes." I said nothing for a while. The fire crackled faintly, a quiet rhythm between us. "She has her story now," he continued. "So does Eliza. Fenwick will no longer write for her. Kelmar, Sterling Vane, has sold his shares and left the city. Breck is under care. And the pavilion, for all its history, has reopened to thunderous acclaim. The ghosts have taken their bow." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Have you?" Holmes gave the faintest smile. "I never stepped on stage, Watson. I merely moved the scenery." We sat in that silence again, though this time it was warmer. The rain began just after 2, a soft, persistent patter against the window pane, as if the city itself were applauding now, not the play, but the way it had ended, or the way it hadn't. A few days later, a package arrived. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with black string. No name on the outside, but Holmes opened it with care. Inside was a small wooden box. He lifted the lid. Within, nestled in pale velvet, lay the black lace glove. Miriam's, the same one found behind the curtain, the same one that had begun the turning of the wheel. Underneath it, a single note, for when the stage forgets again, someone must remember, not the woman, not the actress, only the choice, no return address. Holmes placed the glove in his desk drawer, locked it, and said nothing. But that night, when the lamplight had lowered and the city had fallen to a hush, I heard his violin again. Not the jagged bursts of frustration or the languid improvisations of thought, but something else. A low, slow melody, heavy with restraint and edged with finality. I recognized it, a theme from La Sylphide, a fragment of a role long silenced, but not lost, not anymore. And as the music faded, the fire burned low, and the glove slept in its drawer, I realized that not every mystery ends with triumph. Some end with quiet restoration, with dignity returned, with a whisper behind a curtain answered not with accusation but with grace. And in the city that never stopped speaking, one woman had stepped into silence. On her terms, she had not been claimed, she had chosen. And Holmes, for once, let that choice stand. The morning after the final curtain at the pavilion, a soft hush still hung over Baker Street. The air carried a crispness not yet dulled by smoke or footsteps, and the streets outside glimmered faintly with last night's rain. Holmes stood at the window, his silhouette cut in clear lines against the light. The glove, Miriam's glove, remained locked in the drawer of his desk, but his thoughts, I knew, remained firmly in her orbit. He had not spoken much since receiving the parcel. There had been no announcement of a new case, no impatient rifling through correspondence, no idle experiments to occupy the corners of the sitting room. He simply watched the street and from time to time hummed an old tune beneath his breath, half forgotten and never completed. When he turned to me, there was a peculiar lightness in his gaze, one I had only seen a handful of times across our years of acquaintance. It was not joy, but something quieter. Relief, perhaps. "You know, Watson," he said, "I've always regarded the stage as a place of artifice. Masks, illusions, rehearsed feeling. And yet it gave us truth in this case. Not in what was shown, but in what was withheld." I set down my cup. "Eliza?" "Miriam," he corrected gently. She did what no one expected. She left not to escape, but to preserve something, and when the world tried to make her story into tragedy, she let silence speak instead. He walked to the desk, unlocked the drawer, and removed the glove. It looked older now, frailer somehow, as though its purpose had been fulfilled. Consider what this object became, he mused. A breadcrumb in a ghost story, a riddle in velvet, a relic of betrayal and survival. But most importantly, a signal. It told us that she was still thinking, still watching. He returned it to the drawer and shut it softly. "Do you regret not speaking to her?" I asked. Holmes was quiet for a time. Then he shook his head. What would I have said? That her daughter performed admirably? That her enemies had finally folded into obscurity? She already knew. That's why she came. He returned to the window. Eliza will go on, not as a symbol, not as a shadow, but as herself. She knows now. And she has chosen to act in light, not from beneath a burden. Fenwick is finished, his games exposed. Breck has made peace with silence. And as for Kelmar, his legacy is what it always was, an absence dressed in ambition. Outside, a woman passed beneath the lamppost opposite our window. For a fleeting instant, she bore the same carriage as Miriam Wells once did, shoulders back, eyes ahead, purposeful, unhurried. But it was not her, just someone walking forward, as people do. Holmes turned from the window, brushing his coat sleeve. "Closure is a rare thing, Watson. Most stories stagger on without one. But this had its end, and in that end a kind of justice." He retrieved his violin, which had lain untouched on its stand. With a graceful motion, he brought it to his chin, his bow hovering a moment like a breath before a confession. Then, with the gentlest of gestures, he played. The melody was simple. No flourishes, no performance. Just a quiet refrain, 3 notes, then a pause, then 3 more. The same line that Miriam had once danced to in La Sylphide. He played it not for an audience, but for memory. For someone who had stepped into the wings and, for the first time, been allowed to leave. I sat back, closed my notebook, and let the music carry what remained. When he stopped, the room seemed wider somehow. Holmes set the violin down. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say, and so the story ended, not with applause, but with understanding, not with justice served, but with peace restored, not with revelation, but with release. Just as it should, just as she chose, just as he knew,